So I'm going to begin with some slides. And in here. There we go. All right. So if you were here for the service, and I assume most of you were, Pastor Craig gave a great introduction to what we're going to talk about. What I'm going to talk about, especially, I guess, in terms of, he said, watching the news every night, you get bombarded with information. And I think the problem for a lot of people with information about what's happening in Israel, Palestine, and Lebanon right now is that you don't have a whole lot of background, and so you're getting just a lot of pieces of information, and your response might be, that's really tragic, that's really terrible, or I don't understand what's going on, but you don't have a whole lot to hang it on. So my task here is going to be to try to give you some hangers to put information on. I just finished reading I like to read neuroscience books, and I just finished reading one called now what is it called? The Experience something. I forget now what it was called. And it was about some new information about how the brain operates, and arguing that we always thought that when we went like out into the world, we would get sense information coming in, and we would sort that out and make sense of it and draw conclusions from it. And the new thinking is that, in fact, we send out more information as we look at something. More information comes out of our brain than is going into our brain, so that we have preconceptions of what we're going to see in the world. And it's likely that nobody sees what's really there. We see what our brain has already decided we're going to see, and then we correct it if the information is different. And so that's sort of the approach I want to use today. And all right, come on now. All right, let me go here. All right. So this is my first slide is called a Mooney image. This was in the book. And I just want you to take a look at that and see what you see for a minute. I'm not going to ask you what you see. Just think about what you see there. Okay, so now you've looked at it for a while. So now look at that. Okay, so now you have this image. Look at this for a few seconds. And now we go back to this, and you see something different from what you saw the first time. And here's a really interesting thing about this. I thought it was really interesting that you will never be able to go back to that original image again. You'll always see that dog when you look at this. And this was the demonstration of the fact that we're sending out information. So it's already in your brain. You're sending that information out. So what I want to talk about is some of the things that, as I said, could be hangers in your brain that would help you to understand, or at least think in maybe different ways about what's going on in the Middle East. So the first thing I want to talk about is remind us, and you maybe already knew this, so remind us that things changed after World War II in the international context about the way people thought about wars. World War II was so devastating to the international community that they got together in The Hague, and they passed conventions of crimes against humanity. That hadn't been done before. They said, we don't want this to happen again. All right, so think about Hiroshima and Nagasaki and some of those things. We don't want that to happen again. So let's decide there are going to be laws about this. And they talked about, these are crimes against humanity: murder, extermination, enslavement, deportation, displacement, and other inhumane acts committed against any civilian and against populations. The picture of everybody's blocking mine. Before or during a war. Okay, whether or not the country's law says it's okay, which is very important. It doesn't matter if we think, well, that's okay, we can kill off these people. international law says these are crimes against humanity. And I think a lot of the things that are going on now in the Middle East are easily defined as crimes against humanity. And I'll leave you to think about what you think about that. The second word I'd like you to think about is apartheid. When Carol and I were at a meeting a few weeks ago, there's an association in the ELCA called ALAME. It's the Association of Lutherans of Arab and Middle Eastern Heritage. So we have associations of different ethnic groups in the church. And we had a speaker from the Middle East, Munter Isaac, who you might remember as the one who did the Jesus in the rubble manger scene. He was at the time he was at Christmas Lutheran Church in Bethlehem. And he gave a talk, which I was very moved by. It was very prophetic, I thought. And he said one of the important things about how we think about what's going on in the Middle East is we need to use the vocabulary and call it what it is, because we're letting it slip by not calling it what it is. And one of the words he said we need to use is apartheid. That apartheid is what's going on between the Israelis and the Palestinians. And so this is a statement from Amnesty International. She says, our report reveals the true extent of Israel's apartheid regime. Whether they live in Gaza, East Jerusalem, and the rest of the West Bank, or Israel itself, Palestinians are treated as an inferior racial group and systematically deprived of their rights. We found that Israel's cruel policies of segregation, dispossession, and exclusion across all territories under its control clearly amount to apartheid. The international community has an obligation to act. I mean, obviously no action has been taken, but I think it's important that we have these ideas in mind. The big one, I think, that people are afraid of is the word genocide. And this was a statement from the human rights legal expert Francesca Albanese. She said there are reasonable grounds to believe that the threshold indicating the commission of the crime of genocide has been met. Specifically, well, I don't need to read all that to you, but the important thing here, I think, is that she's very careful. She says reasonable grounds to believe that the threshold doesn't met, because this is a decision that has to be made in the international court to make any difference. Although I'm not even sure that would make any difference, but that's where it has to go. So she's careful about dealing with this, but in fact, there's so much evidence about what's happening. And the idea, I mean, even Pastor Craig mentioned this morning that what he was saying was controversial. I mean, I'm prejudiced, of course, about this, but the idea that the killing of 16,000 plus children and the maiming of so many more is controversial kind of blows my mind. I mean, how is that controversial? That's wrong. I mean, it's simply wrong. Right. And so I think that these are things that we have to deal with as we watch what's going on there. The next thing I want to deal with is ethnic cleansing. And what I chose here is a quotation from a book by Ilan Pappé, who is an Israeli historian and social scientist. And he has a book called The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine. And what he did in this book was go, at the time he was living in Israel, he's left since, not surprising, but he went and got documents, historic documents that were there from the formation of Israel and before, from the Zionists, and saw they had meetings, and like the Nazis did, they kept records of what they said and left them there and didn't destroy the records. And so this is, he said, this is once the decision was to cleanse the land of Palestinians. So he's explaining that the Zionists, the early Zionists, made a decision that the only way Israel could happen was if they cleared the land of Palestinians. And so the group called the Haganah, which was a Zionist, he calls it a Zionist underground military group. Some people call it a terrorist group in Palestine. It says it took 6 months to complete the mission. All right, so this is what is referred to as the Nakba. He said, when it was over, more than half of Palestine's native population, close to 800,000 people, had been uprooted. So you have to remember, this is 1940, so there's a smaller population. It's a big proportion. Had been uprooted. 531 villages had been destroyed and 11 urban neighborhoods emptied of their population. The plan decided upon on 10th of March, 1948, and above all, its systematic implementation in the following months was a clear-cut case of an ethnic cleansing operation regarded under international law today as a crime against humanity. And then there's the issue of who has the right to the land. This is a new thing I found when I was preparing for this, a book by an Israeli historian at Tel Aviv University, now retired, called Shlomo Zand. And he wrote this book called The Invention of the Jewish People. And what he talks about, and I'm surprised these people have the courage to write this stuff, actually. And these are Israeli Jews who write these things. But what he says is he goes back to the documentation where people were writing about this establishment of Israel. And he said, the people the Europeans who were the Zionists said, we felt exiled from our land. And Shlomo Zand said that was a fiction, that they were exiled from their land. He said, the fact is that when Rome cleaned out Palestine of Jews, they didn't clean out Palestine of Jews, they cleaned out Jerusalem of Jews. So there were a lot of Jews left in Palestine. And he says that he believes in the thinking that, in fact, many of the Palestinians today are Jews who converted to Islam to avoid paying taxes. So under Islamic law, when Muslims control an area, the people who are of other religions, especially Jews and Christians and Zoroastrians, are called dhimmi. They have to pay a special tax because they don't serve in the military. So to protect them, they have to pay a special tax. So his argument is, and others have said this, is they converted to Islam so they wouldn't have to pay the tax. So a lot of the Palestinians, he's saying, are really the Jews who were left in Palestine after the Romans left. Okay, and he says, again, this is controversial, nobody likes to hear this in the Jewish community, but the European Jews have no connection to the land, by and large. I mean, there are a few Sephardim who were in Spain and stuff, but the European Jews are Europeans who converted to Judaism. So they have no connection to the land. And what Shlomo Zand says is the people who have the most connection are the Palestinians. They're the ones, if you were talking about right to the land, it's the Palestinians who have the most connection to the land. And then the issue of anti-Semitism. It's still a very vital way to shut down conversations is to call them anti-Semitic. And this is Jewish Voices for Peace, and maybe you've caught on. What I tried to do is quote people who are Israelis or Jewish or sympathizers to say that there are other opinions among them. And if I make an opinion, say, well, you have Arab background, of course you're going to say that. That these people are saying, so this is what they say, they're the largest anti-Zionist Jewish organization in the world. They unequivocally reject the conflation of anti-Semitism with anti-Zionism. You can be an anti-Zionist without being anti-Semitic. You can say they don't have a right to take over this land as settler colonialists without being anti-Jewish. But those are two different things that these are the Jewish Voices for Peace arguing this. And I think the most important thing they said was, we understand these accusations for what they are, a cynical distraction from the ongoing atrocities in Gaza. I mean, if you want to shut people down, we saw this on the college campuses, if it's anti-Semitic to say that stuff, and that shuts down the conversation. Okay. And then from settler colonial studies this is settler colonialist people coming in. This is what the Europeans did in the Americas. They came in, displaced the people who lived here, took over their land. So as with other settler colonialist movements, For Zionism, the control of land is a zero-sum contest fought against the indigenous population. So they said that from the beginning. If we're gonna be able to exist here, we have to clear out the Palestinians, the people who live here, in order that we can have a land. And this is from the Jewish newspaper, sort of, I think of it as the New York Times of Israel. These are currently settlers wanting to resettle Gaza, to take over Gaza. So they had a big meeting, and you see that map there where they show where they're gonna settle in Gaza and take it over. So it hasn't ended yet. And I think this might be my last thing, the right to resist, so that the United Nations General Assembly has said Palestinians have a right to resist. People who are colonized and occupied have a right to resist. Now, they're not saying they get to murder civilians or anything, but they have a right to resist the occupation that has taken over their land. So it's not illegal for them to resist. And there's the dog again to remind you. All right, Carol.
Saïd is next.
I'm sorry, Saïd is next. My bad.
Can you unshare your screen?
Unshare, yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much for being here, and Ryan, what you've done is amazing, so I hope you can keep that in mind. I'm supposed to talk about my family. So I'll tell you their story. I was born in Nazareth, and you know what the Bible says. Nothing good comes out of Nazareth, so keep that in mind. But actually, my family lived in Tiberias 2 years before I was born. Tiberias is on the Sea of Galilee, and they owned a piece of land, and they lived on that land. That was probably the most beautiful piece of land. If you ever go there and go where their house was, there's nothing there anymore. It was destroyed. You'll see the most beautiful view of the Sea of Galilee. So in any case, 1948 was the year when all of this was happening. And basically, in April of 1948, my mother had just given birth to my sister Rose. And the people were told, you have to leave Tiberias for your own safety. Have you heard that said about the people in Gaza? So you go to a place that is safe, and then you can come back. Now, you already know the answer, right? Not gonna happen. So many of my relatives who are Ailabouni is my last name, ended up going to Syria for safety. Syria is only like an hour away or less. Some ended up in Jordan, they're still there. Some ended up in Lebanon. All of that is within half an hour to an hour drive. My immediate family, my father, mother, and siblings ended up in a village called Ailabouni in Galilee. That's where my grandfather was. And many of my tribe were there, so to speak. So they ended up in Ailabouni, which is about 20 minutes away from Tiberias. And they thought, well, when the war is over, we'll be able to go back, right? So 6 months later, at the end of October 1948, the Israeli army came in. They could see they were coming, so they all took refuge in a church, Greek Catholic church in Ailabouni. The priest was there, they had white flags, and when the army arrived, they said, come on out. The first person to come out was shot dead. And they all had to walk over this person who was shot dead. And meanwhile, they took about 12 men, young men, including one of my cousins, to the square next door to that church and shot him dead. And then they told everybody, start walking. And they started walking towards Lebanon. So my dad, my mom, my four siblings at that time started walking. My youngest brother was 4.5 years old. He ended up writing a book about his experience, and it's available on Amazon. So if you look up my last name, you'll find it. So he's not a writer. So whatever he wrote was really just what he discovered about our family. In any case, they started walking, and the kids were hungry. They were crying, they were thirsty, and they had no food. So my dad, who knew Hebrew, asked the soldiers if he could go and get food for the kids. Now, you've seen a lot of starving people on the news. You can imagine what that was like. So they said, yeah, we'll take you to go get some food from the town next door. They ended up taking him to a city called Safed, and they put him in prison. Meanwhile, the rest of the family kept pushed forward towards Lebanon. One of my other cousins, the brother of the one that was shot and killed, was holding my two brothers' hands. One was 4.5 years old, the other one was 6.5 years old. And they were walking and they just called him over and shot him. They left him for dead. He had many bullets, but amazingly, he survived. And somehow he figured out how to get back to Lebanon. He pretended he had some kind of disease and that's why he was bleeding. In any case, they kept walking several days until they got to Lebanon, where they became refugees. Now, fortunately, the priest of the village of Ailabouni was left in town, and he was quite a guy. So he had connections, international connections, and he said to folks, ambassadors and things like that, come over and see the massacre. So they did, and they forced Israel to allow the people of Ailabouni to come back. It was the only village that was going to be destroyed, was the only village where its people were able to come back. If you want to know about the almost 500 other towns that were destroyed and depopulated, you can go to an app called iNakba 1948, and I have it here on my phone, and you read the story of all those towns that now when you go, they're not there. There are either settlements there, towns, but you will see if you walk like I did from Nazareth to the Sea of Galilee. My wife and I did that several years ago. As you walk, you see the cemeteries that are still there, or some mosques that were destroyed but are still there. You could see what was destroyed. So, fortunately, they were able to come back. Let me go back to my dad. So my dad was in prison. My dad, it was interesting. My aunt, before she died, she lived in France. She said to me, you know, your dad loved a Jewish woman in Tiberias, and he wanted to marry her. But it wasn't in those days acceptable to either culture to do that. So he ended up marrying my sister, her sister. And I didn't know that secret. Well, but then I learned something else about my dad. So when he was in prison and he was sure he was going to get killed because several others were killed, a friend of his who was Jewish and a colonel in the Israeli army found him and he said, Rashid, what are you doing here? So he told him what happened. So he pulled him out of prison. What does that tell you? When people know each other and live together, and they were friends in Tiberias, Jews, Christians, and Muslims. And that's the kind of upbringing I grew up with. We can live together. We're supposed to live together. That's what the bishop in Jerusalem said. Jerusalem is for all of us, for Christians, Muslims, and Jews. I love seeing all those religious Jews and Muslims and Christians, he said, wearing their robes and etc. So it was the way I grew up that we can live together. So he was liberated from prison. He was with his friend for a couple of days. Finally, he dropped him off in Nazareth, where a couple of my uncles were living. And then my dad somehow found a way to get to Lebanon and brought my family back. We could not get back to Tiberias. A lot of those homes were destroyed immediately. So we ended up in Nazareth as internally displaced people. And that's where I was born. I'll stop there.
Thank you. Okay. I'm the last to go, so I need to share my screen. And start the PowerPoint. There. Okay, my job is to say a little bit about what are some things that will make for lasting peace And I thought before that, I would explain why it is that the ELCA is so committed to some kind of just and peaceful resolution of this conflict. There have been Lutherans in Palestine since the mid-1800s. How'd they get there? Well, German missionaries, Lutheran German missionaries came and built schools and orphanages, such as, and they then built Redeemer Lutheran Church, which is still a functioning congregation today in the old city of Jerusalem. Augusta Victoria, originally as a way station for German pilgrims to the Holy Land, now a hospital, a hospital. And the Lutheran presence then grew often because of the schools and orphanages. Many people became Lutherans that way. And it was a European mission church, but then in 1947, around the time of the creation of the state of Israel, it became an autonomous denomination in Israel, recognized by the government now, fortunately, and with Palestinian-born bishops and pastors. All of the predecessor bodies of the ELCA, those of you who are new to the ELCA, it's a merger in about 88 of, I think, 3 or 4 different Lutheran bodies, but all of them had an interest in this issue. In 2005, the ELCA passed a very major document at the Churchwide Assembly, and that led to the Peace Not Walls campaign, which lasted until just very recently. The legacy of that church is illustrated in this slide. There are 6 congregations, 4 in West Bank towns, 1 in Old Jerusalem, Redeemer, and then 1 in Amman, Jordan. And they form the Evangelical Lutheran Church in Jordan in the Holy Land. They, besides congregations and Sunday worship, etc., they also have 4 K-12 schools and several other ministries that you can see on the screen. The K-12 schools, by the way, I think are roughly 40% Muslim. So there are Christians of every denomination, not just Lutheran in the schools, but many Muslims send their kids to these schools, in part because they know that the focus is on living together in peace and understanding all the 3 religions and the ethnic groups that are in the Holy Land. And their curriculum is really, in many ways, very inclusive. And so I think that's one of the reasons that they're a popular thing. So the Peace Not Walls campaign was actually, was my job for 5 years in Chicago, with the wonderful person over here who hired me and mentored me. Ailabouni at that time was the ELC Global Mission Director for all of our missions in the Middle East and North Africa, or maybe all of Europe, you added. Big portfolio. So together, the 2 of us and many other people in the ELC worked on the Peace Not Walls campaign. But recently there has been there was a very extensive 2-year review of everything that was happening or not happening in Peace Not Walls. And it led to some conclusions like this. When you talk about peace, sometimes there's complete ignorance of the power differential between the Israeli government and the Palestinian people under occupation, or of course, displaced to other countries like Jordan and Lebanon. And also that just ceasing violence doesn't change underlying structures of inequality and injustice. We know that things like roadblocks, checkpoints, and settler-only roads have completely made what the West Bank is termed by Israeli nonprofit NGOs a Swiss cheese entity of little pockets of Palestinians broken up. There are permanent settlements in the West Bank and East Jerusalem, which are illegal under international law to displace local people in territory occupied in war, and then build permanent towns, and they are cities, they are not encampments. 750,000 settlers live in these settlements, and really only the state of Israel can dismantle the injustice on the ground. And so a lot of people in this review of Peace Not Walls, we also, the people who did it, and it was a combination of volunteers and staff, really listened to our Palestinian siblings in the West Bank. And they said, right now, we don't need you so much to talk about peace. We need you to address the everyday injustice that affects our ability to thrive or to raise our children, to go to work, etc. And so the decision was to move beyond the Peace Not Walls campaign And to seek something, not so much focusing on the end game. By the way, the US government and the ELCA for 30 years in the case of the US government, at least 20 years in the case of the ELCA, has been committed to an end of the occupation and the so-called two-state solution. An Israeli state, a Jewish state, a Palestinian state, Israeli state, and Israel living in harmony with its Arab neighbor nations. Those are the stated goals of both the US government and the ELCA. In terms of why the things on the ground were so important to address, this is just a little bit, and this is a month old now, these statistics. I apologize, I couldn't update them very easily, but these are just some of the ways in which the people in the West Bank are suffering. We obviously, if you pay any attention to international news, you know how the Gazans are suffering, but there's not been very much attention about what's happening in the West Bank. The number of Palestinians killed, the number of settler attacks. A really important one is lost work permits, because many Palestinian families, ironically, are dependent on income earned in settlements. There are Palestinians whose only way to feed their families is to have a work permit to go into a settlement or build new settlements. I've met such Palestinian people on my visits to the region, and that's how they support their families. But if they lose the work permit, then there's no way to replace that income. So these are just a few examples of why the decision by the ELCA, after all of this review of quote Peace Not Walls, is to say we need to sort of shift gears a little bit. So the new program is called Samud, from an Arabic word, which I'll get to in a second, with the tagline "Samud for Justice in Palestine and Israel." There are new staff positions. They're developing new theological resources to support why we are having this position. And there's an emphasis on, if you can possibly come and visit, obviously not too many people are going to go right now. But even if you can't come and visit, take advantage of films and talks by people who have been to the region. Samud is an Arabic word meaning steadfastness. Some people also call it resilience. The term is widely used by the Palestinians, not just theologians, to talk about the way in which they choose to resist the occupation, not by violent means, but by nonviolent means, but not only resistance in the typical sense of the word, but what they call resistance through an existence. So just by keeping their schools going and teaching children that you can live together in peace, as Saïd said, he grew up with initially in Tiberias, that idea that we can all share the land and all live in peace, and have all kinds of social, political, and cultural ways to resist the occupation in a time when clearly intifadas, uprisings, have not succeeded in changing the status quo. The two new staff directors, I'm really happy to have met both of them when Ryan and Saïd and I were all together at the Alama meeting last month. We met Sasha Ghosh-Simonov. You can tell from his name, his mother is Jewish. He himself is an Arabist. He has spent years doing development work in Syria. He's fluent in Arabic, and he has a degree from the University of Exeter in the UK. And he is in our Washington office to guide this church in its global policy on Middle East issues and North African issues. We were very impressed when we got to meet him last month. And then the second person hired, who is now, as of November 1st, the director of this program of Samud for the ELCA, is Maddie Froyland. First, she was a Young Adults in Global Mission. How many of you have heard of Young Adults in Global Mission? Just a few, some good. It's the equivalent of a Peace Corps for Lutheran kids, so you don't have to be a Lutheran, but in I don't know, 30 countries, I'm not sure, I should know that how many there are, including the West Bank and Jerusalem. Young adults out of college, not ever in college, whatever, can go and serve for a year in these settings, often doing education or healthcare or community organizing, youth work, etc. Maddie did that in Jerusalem, and then she stayed on for 3 years as the communication officer for the local church, the ELCJHL. And so she has quite a bit of experience living in the region, and I'm happy to say that you can follow ELCA Samud on Facebook and Instagram, and right now there's over 900 followers, so I'm really happy about that. She's posting something almost every day. And there's an Advent devotions coming, being dropped, as they say, on this Friday, this next week, 4 weeks worth of devotions on this topic. So I'm really happy about those hires. I'm also happy that the ELCA has so many allies in this struggle to end the occupation and liberate the Palestinian, or at least change conditions on the ground to make them more just. I'm not gonna go through all of these, but obviously, if you don't know J Street, that's the main Jewish lobbying group to end the occupation here in the United States, very active on Capitol Hill. Churches for Middle East Peace is a group of like 30 Christian organizations, including the ELCA, that work together. And in fact, the director, May Cannon, is an ordained pastor in the Swedish Covenant Church, and she's coming back from a Holy Land trip and hoping to have a chance to go to the State Department and the White House to talk about what do the Christians think about what's happening? Not just the Christians in this country, but the Christians in the Holy Land. And so there's a number of organizations that all work together. The handout I gave you, if you look at one side of it, it's a couple of years old, but I think it helps answer the question, what are some ways to peace? This was from 2018. A group of all the NGOs that work in Israel, West Bank, and Gaza are together called AIDA. I forget what AIDA stands for. Let's see, I have it written down somewhere. The Association of International Development Agencies, and the Lutheran World Federation is part of that. They drafted this to say, if there's ever going to be another, quote, peace negotiation, such as the Clinton parameters, the Oslo Accords, etc., these 6 conditions have to be met. I won't take time to read them to you, but I really encourage you to read them. But chief among them is accountability to abiding by international law and the use of weapons, for example, and displacement of populations. And on the right column, I think a really important one is, in the past, these so-called peace talks have not included people at the level of civil society. They've been a few representatives of each entity, the Palestinian Authority and the government of Israel. And the idea is that all the people have to be involved in whatever peace efforts there are. Then I was going to say just a little bit about how the election changes things. I'll try to be really brief here. Since the day after the election, about every day, Ryan and I have listened to some kind of webinar from not only Arab American, but Jewish American activists who are very concerned about the future of the Holy Land, especially given the prospective appointments that have been made by the president-elect. So one view is, and this is from an editorial of the Haaretz newspaper the day after the election. The editorial said, now there's even less chance that the US will ever constrain our leader. I mean, what they want to happen is not going to happen, even less chance. But also a sign of hope is that the Arab Americans we've listened to in the last 2 weeks has say that it's really encouraging how much more the American public is aware of the Palestinian cause, and even in Congress. There's an excellent letter, which I'll pass around, and it's from October 29th, so it's pre-election, but it's a letter addressed to Biden saying, please pay attention to the 2 members of the Israeli cabinet that are right now actively planning to annex the West Bank, to get rid of a Palestinian entity, not just in Gaza, but in the West Bank. 2 of the main cabinet supporters or members of Netanyahu's cabinet. And this letter warns Biden to take very seriously that threat. And I'm proud to say it was signed by both Jan Schakowsky, our representative, who happens to be a Jewish American, very committed to peace and justice in the Holy Land, and Senator Dick Durbin. Senator Tammy Duckworth was not a signatory. But this is a number of members of Congress have signed this. Also, people are very encouraged by the level of political support on the ground. But concern, for example, about the quashing of protest, whether it's on campuses or elsewhere. How can we have an open dialogue about these issues? So just a couple of things that we can do. Definitely listen to the Palestinians, follow their example of resistance through existence, etc. A lot of things are happening in our synod. I won't talk about all of them, but I'm really happy that the bishop asked me to reorganize the working group on the Middle East, and I've had really wonderful support from people doing that. We had a resolution and a memorial passed at the Synod Assembly. I won't go into all the things, but I will tell you that we are hoping to have a series of Zoom forums for anybody in the whole synod that would be like on a weekday night, maybe watching a short documentary and then having a panel discussion afterwards. So we're doing our best to try to raise awareness in this synod. I'm going to stop sharing and ask you to look at the other side of the handout. And apologies to those of you online. If you didn't find them, go to the Zoom link page. And I think Renee uploaded them to that page. But just this, to answer the question, how can we all get involved? I made this handout for our Solidarity Day that we had on October 19th at our Saviors in Arlington Heights. We had to think about, Saïd was one of the participants. Brian and Craig were ushers at the worship service. That was pretty awesome. And it was, I think about 80 people came to hear about the Holy Land and the issues in the Holy Land. So notice that if you are at all interested in getting messages from me, like maybe twice a month, you can join our email list. That is we have a website, and then the email list is the second thing. I put tiny URLs because you don't have hot links on a hard copy. So I can send you the hot links if you want them. But if you join our email list, you will get updates roughly once or twice a month, sometimes more often. There's other resources that you consult on here. There's a link to Churches for Middle East Peace, and I really recommend that you subscribe to their advocacy alerts and their monthly summaries of everything that's happening. There's a way if you would like to give to Lutheran World Relief, Disaster Relief for Gaza, don't go to the main Lutheran Disaster Relief page, because what you give there gets divided across the world. I mean, it's a worthy thing to give to, but if you want to give just to Relief for Gaza and the West Bank, go to this link, Middle East Crisis Relief, and I hope the tiny URL will still work. If you want to support the schools, there's a link for those, and Augusta Victoria, a link for those. So we really, really appreciate your coming today, and I think we'll stop the recording now, keep the Zoom on, and we'll be happy to hear your questions and your thoughts.